Welcome to the special event hosted here at the Florida Internet and Television Studio in Tallahassee. I'm Troy Kinsey, Capitol correspondent for Bay News 9 Tampa and News 13 Orlando, joined here by my colleague Gary Fineout of the Associated Press. And together we will serve as moderators for this 45-minute debate between House Speaker Richard Corcoran and Tallahassee Mayor Andrew Gillum. Speaker Corcoran is a Republican from Land O'Lakes. Mayor Gillum is a declared Democratic candidate for governor. And we should mention Speaker Corcoran is considering a campaign for governor himself. So here's how this debate came to be. A little over 3 weeks ago, Speaker Corcoran wrote Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen requesting DHS investigate both Mayor Gillum and St. Petersburg Mayor Rick Kreisman for what he calls illegal sanctuary cities policy. Now, if that term sounds familiar, the House last month passed a measure, House Bill 9, which would crack down on so-called sanctuary cities, places where local authorities don't honor federal detainer requests and transfer undocumented immigrants in their custody who have been flagged for deportation to federal authorities. Mayor Gillum has called that bill a, quote, misguided and ill-informed attack on local cities and municipalities and immigrants. The Speaker, in a new TV ad paid for by his political committee, says sanctuary cities invite immigrant crime and that, quote, on my watch, Florida will never be a sanctuary state. On Twitter, the Speaker agreed to debate the issue anywhere, anytime. The Mayor took him up on the offer, and here we all are tonight in Tallahassee. The Mayor and the Speaker both agreed on the terms of this debate. It'll be only about House Bill 9. They'll each have 2 minutes to introduce themselves and their position. Gary and I will then begin asking questions we've come up with. We've also selected questions submitted via social media. We've screened those, and those will be part of the discussion here tonight as well. Answers, no more than 2 minutes. Rebuttals, no more than 30 seconds. And there will be 2-minute closing statements. We held a coin flip here, football style. Speaker Corcoran won. He chose to go first, and so you are recognized to deliver your opening statement tonight, Speaker Corcoran.
First, Gary and Troy, thanks for hosting this. And Mayor Gillum, I have to say, I think that you being here, being a man in the arena, in the fight, says a lot about your candidacy, and it also says a lot about your opponents who could have been here and are not. So I applaud you for that. But this is a debate about something very simple. There was a young, beautiful woman. Her name was Kate Steinle. She was walking with her father on the streets of San Francisco when she was savagely killed by a bullet from an illegal criminal immigrant. And so what we have is she gets shot. She's being cradled by her father. She's in her father's arms, and she looks up to him, and she says, "Dad, help me." And when I saw that in 2015, it reminded me of my own daughter, Kate. My daughter, Kate, this week will turn 17 years old. And I thought, what about the horror that one day we would be walking together, and she would be shot and killed by an illegal immigrant who was given sanctuary status in a city, a completely needless and unnecessary death. And she would be cradled in my arms, and she would look up to me and she'd say, "Dad, help me." Well, I thought about it, and I can help. I was the Speaker of the House. So we filed House Bill 9. House Bill 9 bans sanctuary cities from ever happening in the state of Florida. Basically, it's very simple. All it says is state and local authorities, you need to cooperate with the federal authorities, and if you have a criminal illegal immigrant in your custody, you have to hold them for just 48 hours until the authorities can come. That's all the bill does. And yet, we have a situation where people are asking a simple question. Would Kate Steinle still be alive today if it were not for sanctuary policies? The answer to that question is yes, she would. And so we have to do everything we can. And tonight in this debate, it's a simple choice. Are we going to side with the victims and the citizens, or are we going to side with those who are criminals and illegal immigrants? I think the choice is easy. Thank you.
That was exactly 2 minutes, and Mayor, you're recognized.
Thank you very much, Troy, Gary, Mr. Speaker. Thank you for taking time. I will tell you that up front that this debate is not about the rule of law. It is not about a disagreement between whether or not we agree with the rule of law. We both do. What this is about is an ad that the Speaker has chosen to spend $1.4 million across the state of Florida trying to convince Floridians that undocumented persons are either murderers or all-out intent to harm us. But in some ways, it's not just about that. It's also about who we are as a state and who we want to be, the kind of state that we want to leave for our children and our children's children. I believe one of the reasons that the Speaker chose not to have this debate in front of a live audience of people is because he didn't want to have to look in the faces of immigrants and of dreamers and try to defend his indefensible position. For those of you who are watching at home or wherever it is that you may be watching this evening, I want you to know that I'm not standing here today just for myself. In fact, I'm standing here today for every single one of you and anybody who has ever been told that they don't belong. Having grown up in South Dade, an area called Richmond Heights, to my mother who was a school bus driver and my daddy who was a construction worker. I was the first of my siblings to graduate from high school and the first to graduate from college. I know well what it means to have heard where you don't belong, where you shouldn't go, what is and is not for you. And I'm proud today to be standing not only as the mayor of Florida's capital city, but also as a candidate for governor. I'm also pleased to be standing alongside immigrants and, quite frankly, anybody who has ever been derided or insulted or made to feel ashamed by the acolytes of Donald Trump. I stand today saying that they will not win, that there are more of us who believe in decency and common decency. And today, it is my hope that by the conclusion of this conversation, that two things will happen. One, that the Speaker of the House will apologize and take this ad down here in the state of Florida and wherever else it may be being advertised.
Mayor, time.
And finally, I hope that we can leave today feeling more connected and united as one state.
Okay, with the formalities out of the way, the fun really begins here, gentlemen. You both likely wouldn't be here tonight speaking about this rift if not for the president's focus on it during the 2016 campaign and the role it's played during his first year in office. Within days of taking the oath of office, he issued an executive order to withhold federal funding from local governments that refuse to turn over information about the immigration status of individuals within their jurisdiction. The order has since been blocked by a federal judge, but it does raise the question of how involved cities and counties ought to be in immigration enforcement. Local police, as you know, regularly cooperate with the feds in drug stings, for example. Why should or shouldn't there be differences with regard to immigration law? We'll begin with the mayor.
Well, I'll say that this red herring that these kinds of policies in some way shelter individuals intent to do us harm, I think couldn't be further from the truth. If you commit a crime in our city, in the city of Tallahassee or in any city across the state of Florida, you're going to be held accountable for committing a crime or an action against the people who call these communities home. That's the difficult work that our law enforcement officials do every single day, trying to protect and keep us all safe. In my experience as a mayor, what we've seen is that the best kind of policing is policing done at the community-based level, where officers are building relationships and sustaining relationships that are in community on a daily basis. What this bill does, in my opinion, and what others like it coming at the federal level, is disrupts the important trust that must exist between the people and the police officers who serve them. Such efforts to disrupt that harmony, disrupt that relationships, makes it much more difficult to get folks who are the victims of crimes or have observed crimes to come forward and to share what it is that they know. And that's why I believe that we ought to have law enforcement officials at the local level do the job that they have been tasked to do. And that ICE and Homeland Security, which is budgeted to the tune of billions of dollars a year, should also be allowed to do their work.
And Speaker, question to you.
What I would say in response is this is not even a difficult thing. Is it okay for an illegal immigrant who's engaged in criminal behavior to be allowed out to roam free? That's a simple question. And to say that that somehow is going to, the crazy liberal logic that that's going to be, or make our streets more unsafe, when you take a criminal off the streets and you have them in custody, releasing them back into the streets makes it more unsafe, that's just crazy liberal logic. Nobody believes that. And all the bill does is tell local and state law enforcement cooperate with the federal authorities and detain that illegal immigrant engaged in the criminal activity. It's important. The number one job of an elected official is to protect our citizens. If we can't keep our society safe, then all those other issues, all those other debates become meaningless. It's the primary function of every elected official.
Mayor, do you care to rebut?
Simply to say I agree that it's the primary function of not only law enforcement and elected officials to keep their community safe, but let's be very honest about the lengths and breadths that this bill goes to. This bill potentially creates ICE agents out of our school teachers and professors. It creates ICE agents out of our government officials, out of our law enforcement officials whose primary job is to keep their community safe. If you commit a crime in any community, in any city throughout this state, you will be adjudicated in the court of law within that community. And all we're saying is we absolutely ought to be fidel to not only the law, but also to the Constitution of the United States.
Time now for my colleague Gary Fineout to ask a question.
Thank you. Volusia County Sheriff Michael Chitwood calls House Bill 9 a, quote, lose-lose proposition for local law enforcement. He says that the bill will marginalize people in certain communities and push them away from police and make it harder to solve crimes. He also says it will strain local resources and make agencies more likely to get sued. Why is Sheriff Chitwood right or wrong? To you first, Mr. Speaker.
He's wrong on all the above. I mean, the reality is all this bill does, and to your point, Mayor Gillum, it doesn't make ICE agents out of any of the people you listed. If you read the bill, it simply says this: once an illegal immigrant is detained for engaging in criminal activity, they're in custody, they've been arrested and they're in custody. That's not a teacher or that's a law enforcement officer has arrested that person for criminal behavior, and now they're in custody. And so once they're in custody, all we are asking is, can that person be held for 48 hours at the federal authorities' request to hold that person so they can see about deporting them? That's all the bill does. And the consequences are staggering. I can tell you right now, to the sheriff of Volusia County, look at Sarah Root, a 21-year-old college graduate. She graduated from Bellevue University with a 4.0 GPA. The very next day, she was driving down the road in Omaha, Nebraska, which is a sanctuary city, and a gentleman who was let out under the sanctuary policies went careening into her car and killed her. He was street racing. He was put under arrest, and guess what? Guess where he is now? Nobody knows. He fled again. And yet, Sarah Root, her whole life in front of her, 4.0 GPA, college graduate, gone. That's just unacceptable. And here's the deal. I don't want a single parent in the state of Florida to have some police officer knock on their door and say, hey, Mr. Corcoran, your daughter, your son was unnecessarily and needlessly killed because federal, state and local authorities would not simply cooperate with the feds and hold a criminal illegal immigrant for 48 hours. That's never going to happen on my watch.
So there is a process of judicial warrants, which again, the Speaker makes it appear as if anyone who commits a crime and you happen to be undocumented, that you are let free to roam the streets and commit random acts of violence against people. And nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, the Cato Institute, which is not a bastion of the left, a pretty conservative research institute, found that immigrant communities are far less likely to commit crimes than those that are native born. And that, again, is a conservative study. The truth is that any loss of life is unfortunate, deeply unfortunate. And we ought to respect those lives by offering our respective condolences to their families. But we absolutely should avoid politicizing the death of any of those individuals. The reason why we're able to call these individual incidences to the attention of everybody is, quite frankly, because of how rare they happen. We have high incidences of U.S. born individuals who commit crimes. And just as foreign-born individuals who commit crimes, they have and will be adjudicated before a court of law. They're not roaming free in our streets to go and commit all of these kinds of random acts of violence. That's disingenuous, and the bill absolutely goes further than just dealing with law enforcement and temporary detainments. But if we were just to rest our hat there, we know that the cost there is extremely expensive for our communities. In Miami-Dade alone, a study showed that $13.1 million of what they've had to encounter down there. And we don't have a whole bunch to celebrate about that experiment.
Speaker, want to follow up?
Again, it's just not the case. I mean, the reality is you're quoting studies, and by the way, those studies are surveys. And here's my experience as a lawyer. When you send a criminal or an illegal immigrant a survey and say, hey, self-report yourself, guess what they never do? They never self-report themselves. But there are studies, and there are facts. In Florida prisons, we have 5,000, almost 5,000 criminal illegal immigrants in our jails. 27% were homicides or murders. 23% were sex crimes. Think about that. That's 1,000 moms and 1,000 dads, homicide victims. That's 1,000 moms and 1,000 dads whose children were sex crime victims. Go knock on their door. Go Go knock on their door and tell them there's no consequence, there's no threat to the fact that you have a law on the books that says you cannot detain a criminal, illegal immigrant for 48 hours and you let them back on the streets. And that's exactly what we prohibit in that bill. But you have a Democrat colleague, Representative Smith. He's filed 1333. And in 1333, he wants to make the entire state a sanctuary state, every city within it. Do you support that bill? Do you support allowing criminal, illegal immigrants to be able to go out onto the streets and not be detained for 48 hours, as Representative Smith would like?
Well, time on that, Speaker, and we'll transition to that issue right now, if it's okay with you, Mayor, about these bills that would do the opposite of what Republicans in the Florida House have been attempting to do. Where do you stand on those?
Yeah, well, let me just be very clear. If you commit a crime in our communities, you ought to be held accountable to the extent of the law, adjudicated by the judicial process in those communities. What the Speaker is arguing are not judicial findings. These are individuals, these are bureaucrats who make these decisions. And as I said before, what it typically does is basically turn us into a police state. It makes complicit not only law enforcement officials, it makes complicit governmental officials. We're frankly, if we follow the Speaker's logic, would turn this state into a show me your papers state. And if someone came up to me and asked me for my papers today, I'd have a driver's license, but my mama has my birth certificate. And she lives in Georgia. I'd have to go and find that. All I'm simply saying is that we should not follow this red herring that says that because we have individuals in this state that may be undocumented, one, that all of them are criminals or intend to do us harm, because there could be nothing that's further from the truth. And that's been substantiated by well-respected researchers from the right and not just those on the left. What this is really about is what kind of state we are trying to become. What this is about is whether or not we're a state where we go around turning public officials and educators and law enforcement officials into ICE agents, or whether we have them do the job that they do. Let's be clear. The Department of Homeland Security gets billions of dollars a year to do their job. And all I want is for local law enforcement to be able to do their jobs, to keep our communities safe, to make sure that they're building relationships that are trusting, that invites the public to give them impact, that allows them to solve crimes and keep our cities safe. This is not being demanded by law enforcement folks. It's not being demanded by our cities. This is simply a political ploy to appeal to the hardest right of this state, and that's why it's been rejected and deplored and TP'd in the Senate.
Speaker, do you want to follow up?
I do. Again, here, first of all, I'll say it, Mayor Gillum, read the bill. Nowhere does it give teachers that authority. It's not bureaucrats. It's to call our frontline law enforcement officers who put their jobs and lives on the line every day to go out there. They're the ones who arrest these criminals. And the only time this bill applies is when that criminal is under arrest by a frontline law enforcement officer. Once he's under arrest, then we say, this is what the bill does and nothing more. Then we say, protect, hold that person for 48 hours until the federal law enforcement can come down and see about deporting them. And the other thing is, you keep saying undocumented. There's nothing in federal law, state law, or ordinance that talks about undocumented. There's nothing undocumented about them. They are illegal. Our statute calls them illegal aliens, aliens who are not within the law. That would be no different than if I steal your car. I take your car and I get pulled over and they ask me for the title of the car, and I say I don't have the title. And they say, well, we're going to call you the undocumented owner of that vehicle. No, I'm an illegal possession of your vehicle. And what we are talking about is law and order and protecting our citizens. There's nothing welcoming about taking criminal illegals and putting them back out on the streets so that they can cause significant harm or even death to our sons and daughters. That's unacceptable.
But as a quick follow-up, just a quick follow-up, sir, do you feel that you're sort of grossly simplifying your bill? Because your bill does a lot more than just the 48 hours. It creates civil course of action. It basically tells people, it tells local officials, if you do not follow this policy, you are subject to fines and investigation. So I'm just saying, you say the bill is simple when it's much more than that.
We're talking about the interaction with the criminal illegal immigrant. And then the rest of what the bill does is it says this: you're an elected official. You held your hand and said, I'll follow the Constitution. I'll follow the rule of law. I'll protect you. That's why I want you to vote for me. And then you have these elected officials not following the law, not cooperating with the federal government and turning out into the street criminal illegal immigrants. So what the bill says is, if that happens, and you're Mr. Steinle, and your daughter was completely and utterly, unnecessarily killed, you have a cause of action against that city who is engaged in that kind of behavior, who has a sanctuary, who creates a hideout for those criminal illegal immigrants. It also says if you're an elected official and you held your hand and you promised, I promise they'll follow the law. It says to you, we can remove you or suspend you from office. We can withhold funds to those cities. That's the whole point of the bill. The whole point of the bill is to end criminal illegal immigrants being on our streets and to force all the elected officials to follow the law and cooperate with the federal authorities and hold that person for 48 hours so that they can look at deportation.
The Speaker, first I want to say illegals is not a noun. People don't get to be illegals. And the reason why people use language like that is simply to dehumanize, because if you can dehumanize people, you can do anything to them. Let me admit up front right now that I do believe that we ought to have comprehensive immigration reform in this country. The federal government has had an opportunity after opportunity, and I believe they just opened debate now on a new piece of legislation that's yet to be described to deal with immigration. The Speaker is a huge fan of preemption, which means to have those issues that are dealt with at a higher level of government to be reserved to be dealt with at that government. Well, immigration policy in the United States is a right reserved for the federal government. They determine who comes and who goes and who stays. And we've got 20 million undocumented individuals, and a host of them, 50,000 young people in this state who are DACA recipients, who are standing in complete and total limbo. And so what I'm simply suggesting is that we allow law enforcement to do the jobs that they were selected, and went out to do, and that is to keep our communities safe. And we should not be taking steps that undermine law enforcement and their ability to keep our cities and our communities safe.
A process question.
What we're doing is strengthening law enforcement. What we are doing is giving them the tools to keep our society safe. And illegal is an adjective. What I said is it's an illegal immigrant. That's a noun. It's an illegal immigrant. There's nothing undocumented about them. That's the point. And we have to tell the truth. We have to start talking and not using these crazy buzzwords that aren't even true. Let's shoot straight with the people and say what we're dealing with in this legislation is an illegal immigrant who is engaged in criminal behavior. And all we're saying is hold that person, don't put him back on our streets. Hold that person and give him to the federal authorities so that they can begin deportation procedures. All the constitutional protections, due process, all of that is in this legislation. All the protections for illegal immigrants who witness or are victims of crime are protected in this legislation. And all of our constitutional protections against discrimination, whether it be your race or your gender, all protected in this legislation.
It again is nice on paper. The Speaker glazes over the wide-ranging and sweeping implications of his policy. He wants us to think that it's simple and it's easy and it's just light work. But the truth is even on paper, the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution is what you and I both have sworn our highest fidelity to, the Constitution of the United States. And so we ought to make sure that what we're doing, one, is constitutional, but the practical on-the-ground implications of individuals having to show their papers in the state of Florida, where we create an environment where, again, teachers and professors and law enforcement officials are now demanding people's birth certificates when they arrest them or suspect them of being undocumented is un-American. If you commit a crime, you will be held accountable for that crime in our communities, all across the state, all 67 counties and over 400 cities. There is no loophole in that. There is no gap in that. There is no need, quite frankly, for this policy or this type of legislation other than to deride, to divide, and to create other legal forms, in my opinion, of racial profiling. The reason why the Speaker would not have to worry about that as a concern is because when teachers and others decide to call people out for potentially being quote-unquote illegals or undocumented individuals, it's usually black and brown communities that are most indirectly affected by that. And we've got to be honest with that as well. That is true and that exists in our society. And we certainly shouldn't be trying to codify that in law.
Speaker, you mentioned your view that crazy buzzwords are being used on the left side of this debate, but you've heard critics of the bill argue it is politically inspired. It passed the House a few weeks ago, but if you look at where things stand right now at the Capitol, most people would say it's highly unlikely it'll pass the GOP-controlled Senate. if the issue really is about public safety, why isn't your own party united in support of it?
I think that ever since the 2015 Act, where Kate Steinle was just unlawfully and unnecessarily killed, we filed that bill in 2016, we filed it in 2017, we filed it again in 2018. Sometimes it takes a while to get things passed, but it's not dead for the session. We think there's still an opportunity to get it passed, and that's why we'll keep fighting for it. But honestly, you have the bill here. I hand it to Mayor Gillum.
I've read it, sir.
There's nothing in there about teachers, Mayor. There's nothing. You keep saying teachers. The only people who have to show their papers are the criminal illegal immigrants who engaged in a crime. That's the only people who have to show their papers, and that's just being held for 48 hours. It's a real crisis. It's a real threat to society. When you take, I'll give you another, there's two girls in Virginia Beach, a sanctuary city, driving home, 17 and 16 years old. Tessa and Allison are sitting at a stoplight, and all of a sudden, their car is obliterated, completely destroyed by an illegal immigrant out on the streets because it was a sanctuary city, let out, and he was almost 4 times the legal limit drunk, driving drunk and at a high rate of speed, and killed both of those girls. It's a real threat. Nobody in our entire state, I'll say it to everyone out there, nobody, and I will fight, needs to have a situation where you hear a knock on your door and a law enforcement officer comes to you and says, "I'm sorry, Mr. Corcoran," whoever it is, your daughter, your son, was needlessly killed because we had sanctuary policies in this state that let a criminal, illegal immigrant out on the streets. My fight is to make sure that never happens to one of you, not one single person in the state. And can I say one more thing, Mayor? Is you treat illegal immigrants better than you treat your own American citizens in your district. If you have an American citizen in your district who commits a crime, and now he's down in Miami or West Palm Beach or wherever, and he gets arrested, the policies you have right now is that American citizen who commits a crime is detained and held. They don't let him go. They even drive him county by county or state by state, wherever the hold is, and take him right back to those authorities. But yet a criminal, illegal immigrant, we can't hold. That makes no sense. Who thinks that's fair?
So I want to take the speaker at his word when he expresses with such passion his desire to keep all families safe. And I think we all have to recognize that any loss of life, any one, is too great. But we've had senseless mass shootings. In fact, 3 days before I was sworn in mayor of the city of Tallahassee, there was an attempted mass shooting at Florida State University, which resulted in one student who, through his bravery, ended up becoming a paraplegic. We've seen what happened under Dylan Roof. We've seen what happened at the Fort Lauderdale Airport not too long ago. We've seen what happened in Las Vegas and at Sandy Hook. The speaker, if he was so sincere about his intent to make sure that no life is lost unnecessarily, then I would ask him to stand up to the NRA and to the gun lobby, who is interested every session in passing more and more bills that say guns everywhere, or to something as simple as an individual who has committed domestic violence in their own home not being able to have a gun, because the wife or the spouse or the partner who lives in that home is 16 times more likely to be killed by gun violence. And so the truth is that this is a red herring. If we're sincere about helping save lives, there are things that we can actually do, things that are within the purview of the Speaker of the House to do. But when it comes to keeping communities safe, and I say this as a mayor of Florida's capital city, and as a city commissioner prior to that, who got complaints from our law enforcement officials that one of the things that they have to address most consistently are individuals who will not share information. And what we don't want to do is exacerbate the inability for law enforcement to get access to the necessary data and information that they need in order to carry out the justice and law in this state and in all of our communities around the state of Florida.
We have one more question of our own before we get to the social media component here. I'd like to ask you, Mayor Gillum, you've called President Trump's executive order that would have revoked federal funding for a city like yours had it not been blocked by a federal court, quote, an attack on cities. But it doesn't pertain to all cities, only those that don't comply with federal detainers, and federal funding is exactly that. It's dispersed at the whim of the federal government. Why isn't the administration, in your view, justified in closing that spigot?
Well, I'll tell you, and I hate to use this argument, but the during the debate around the Affordable Care Act, you had states, including ours and others, who protested and basically said that the federal government could not use commerce and the power of the purse to compel states into complicity. And now, all of a sudden, compelling states into complicity, potentially asking them to break the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution of the United States, is now acceptable. It is not acceptable. I don't believe that the president has any pure intentions. And quite frankly, at one point, the speaker was of good mind and good conscience and challenged the president before he was the president as being a divisive figure and a flip-flopper on issues. The speaker himself has, over the course of his service in this legislature, at one point signed off on driver's licenses for DACA recipients. I just hate that he now appears to be rehearsing for the Donald Trump apprentice rather than as the third most powerful person in this state, figuring out ways that we legitimately keep our community safe, not divide, not have folks running around in fear, not having the 50,000 DACA recipients in this state in legal limbo about what's going to happen over the next couple of days and weeks. This is a serious issue that impacts people in a very, very serious way. And the way that we are portraying the role that immigrants and undocumented immigrants play in this state, I think is unfortunate. And in my opinion, I believe this debate is deserving of a higher level playing field of conversation.
Speaker, you're a lawyer. What's your interpretation?
Well, first, let's address what you're saying, Mayor Gillum. First of all, you keep talking about the Fourth Amendment. There's no right under the Fourth Amendment for somebody who comes across our border illegally and then wants to stay here. They have no Fourth Amendment right. They have a right to due process over the proving that they're an illegal immigrant. But they
that's part of Fourth Amendment.
Yeah, but they have a due process right, not substantive. They have a due process substantive right on whether or not they're an illegal immigrant. That's it. They have no other rights. They're illegal. Second of all, you bring up California, and now you're talking about gun control. This debate was supposed to be about House Bill 9, and now you're talking about gun control. California is a gun control state. The absolute statistics and facts, whether it's Chicago or California, it doesn't matter. Gun control has done nothing whatsoever to reduce crime rates. In fact, those crime rates go up because the only people who have those guns are the criminals. That's not what this debate is about. What this debate is about, though, is, and you've yet to answer, Mayor, you've yet to answer, do you support Representative Smith's 1333? Because if this is not a big deal, and you want to protect the state from this legislation that says we can never be a sanctuary state, why don't you say, I would support Representative Smith's 1333 that makes every single city, every part of our state, a sanctuary state, a haven, a hideaway for criminal illegal immigrants? Can we just get a yes or no on that? Can we get a yes or no on whether you support House Bill 9 that says we will do whatever we can to protect our citizens? We're not going to allow a criminal illegal immigrant to go out on the street and threaten one single Floridian.
Yeah, let me state very plainly where I am on this. I think that we ought to make sure that our law enforcement officials have the necessary tools that they need in order to keep our communities safe. That if you commit a crime in my city or any other city across the state of Florida, you will be held accountable for committing that crime. But what we will not do, not here in the city of Tallahassee, and I hope in this state we won't do, is criminalize people off their personhood. Criminalize people because of where they come from or the language that they speak. If you break the law, you pay the penalty. But what we're not about to do is go around asking people for their papers, to show their papers in the state of Florida. We are deserving as a country of comprehensive immigration reform. I would demand that Congress do its job and make sure that we're tending to those needs to ensure that we've got comprehensive immigration reform and that people aren't in legal limbo. The power when it comes to immigration in this country is a federal one. And at the local level and at the state level, we ought to make sure that our law enforcement officials have the tools that they need to do the job that they have sworn an oath to do. And that we, as elected officials, would not dig to the bottom of the barrel of politics and derision and division as a way to make a political point, rather than what it means to be a representative for the very diverse and richly diverse state that is Florida.
Well, if you can imagine, we only have about 11 minutes left. You two fill time with the best of them. We're going to transition now to those social media questions. I think we might just have one to ask this evening, but we have been asking people to give us their views about what they think ought to be discussed at this debate using the hashtag Sanctuary Cities Debate. As you might imagine, a couple of people submitted questions, and Gary has one of those tonight. Gary.
Well, we have a question from Bob Buchholz of Havana, Florida, who said, since when do municipalities and states get to choose which federal laws they will enforce?
We'll give this one to the mayor first.
Sure. So first of all, we should enforce all of the legal justifiable laws that exist on the books. And we do that, by the way. Anyone who would suggest that we don't follow the law is simply mistaken. There is not a sanctuary city in the state of Florida at all. There is not even a legal definition of what a sanctuary city is here in the state of Florida, or quite frankly, anywhere. What we are is a state of laws. We follow those laws. Our local government officials and our law enforcement officials do a superb job at trying to do that. What I'm simply suggesting is that we don't undermine the rule of law, that we don't undermine the important work that law enforcement officials are doing every day to ensure the safety and the security of our communities. Not to create laws that subvert what is on the books, that our fidel responsibility is to the Constitution of the United States, the Constitution of the state of Florida and its statutes, and our local ordinance and rules. And that's exactly what we do. We don't do that any differently here in the state of Florida, in the city of Tallahassee, or in any city or county that I know of in the state of Florida.
I think that, again, I'll go through it, Mayor Gillum, but and all your points. First of all, we have 17 sitting sheriffs. The sheriffs in the state of Florida, the Constitution, are the chief law enforcement officer, sworn to protect their citizens. 17 sheriffs voluntarily entered into agreements with the federal authorities to hold and detain for 48 hours these criminal illegal immigrants because of the threat they pose to their communities. 17 sheriffs have already done that voluntarily. They recognize that threat. And you keep saying it's some sort of a political statement. There's nothing political about this. It's about protecting our citizens. But if you want to talk about political, 3 hours ago, you sent out an email to everybody trying to raise money off this issue, trying to raise money off the threat of illegal immigrants who are criminals and the threat they pose to society. And as far as Bob, I can tell that the writer from Havana, it's worse. It's worse than he thinks. If you're a criminal American, how is it right for a criminal American citizen to be able to be held and transported and detained, but an illegal immigrant criminal, we won't do that for? How is that even fair? And the final thing I'd say is you've said some great long answers about necessary tools to law enforcement and holding people accountable, but you haven't said, do you support Carlos Smith's 1333? Yes or no?
I have stated several times what my policy is. I've stated what it is that I'm standing here this evening trying to advocate for, and that is the rule of law. That is also making sure that we do everything that we can to keep our community safe and don't create public policy that undermines the obligation and the difficult job that law enforcement already has to do. We fund the Department of Homeland Security to the tunes of tens of billions. They ought to do their job. If you commit a crime in our communities, you should be held accountable for doing that. That is the law. That is exactly what we do. This new burden, this new ambiguous burden that is included in this particular piece of legislation, which I will remind you again has stalled in the Senate because there's nobody over there that agrees that this is right and good and just policy. They believe that the laws that exist on the books are exactly the ones that we ought to have in order to keep our state safe and keep our counties and our cities doing the important work that they should be doing, which is following the rule of law and making sure that our communities don't get more divided, that we make it more difficult for law enforcement to do their job, but that we make it easier and better for them to do that important work.
So we got a question clearly intended for the mayor. Here's one clearly intended for the speaker. Keeping in mind we have about 7 minutes left here before we get to closing statements. Actually, that time would include the closing statements. Patty Grant is asking the speaker, quote, why are you appearing in an ad that grossly misrepresents the killing of Kate Steinle? You would take issue with the premise of the question, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. The commercial simply says this: is it okay to have a criminal illegal immigrant and have state and local authorities not cooperate with the federal government and not hold that criminal illegal immigrant until they can come and take custody of that individual? And the commercial says this: what's the consequence? Would Kate Steinle still be alive today if it wasn't for sanctuary policies? Yes. She'd absolutely be alive. I have 6 children, aged 17 to 5, 3 girls and 3 boys. I can assure you that I'll do everything in my power to make sure the tragedy that happened to Kate Steinle will never happen, not only to one of my children, but to any of your children. That's what the commercial says. We've got to put a law on the books that forces politicians to keep their word. Campaign one way and govern this exact same way. Stop doing the double talk. You said you would raised your hand, you'd uphold the rule of law, and you protect our citizens. This is a bill that simply protects citizens from illegal, criminal immigrants. And that's what the commercial says.
But Ms. Steinle, her killer, was acquitted of the charge of murder, and the defense was able to convince a jury that her killing was by accident and that the gun ricocheted off a building. So, I mean, when you have your ad where you basically have someone gunning someone down, and yet you're talking about Kate Steinle, why isn't that a misrepresentation?
It's not, because the fact of the matter remains. Would Kate Steinle be alive? Would she be alive but for a sanctuary policy that allowed a criminal with multiple felonies, who had been multiple times deported, allowed that criminal to roam the streets? If he did not take advantage of the sanctuary policy of San Francisco, today, Mr. Steinle is walking down the sides and the piers of San Francisco just like he did that fateful day. That's what that commercial says. And it's that simple. And I'll tell you right now, all err on the side of victims. All err on the side of citizens every day of the week over criminals and illegal immigrants.
I'm sorry, I've got to counter that. The truth is that this ad is a gross misrepresentation of what took place. A jury did find that death to be accidental, albeit unfortunately we should be careful not to politicize it. But the speaker went even further. In his ad, he decided to outfit his version of an undocumented immigrant, or in his words, an illegal immigrant, in a hoodie, as if that point would be lost on any of us in the same state where Trayvon Martin was killed, for wearing a hoodie, quite frankly. And this is the same kind of thing that I'm really deeply afraid and troubled might happen if we create and pass laws like this, where we give this kind of license to individuals to go up, demand papers of individuals, and request that people demand that their proof be shown in order to live here in this state. The speaker himself is an immigrant, spent the early years of his life in Canada. And I don't have anything against Canadians, by the way, but the point being, for many of the undocumented people who have chosen to call Florida home, that have chosen this state, likely spent less time in their countries of origin than the speaker spent in the country of Canada before immigrating here to the United States. All I'm saying is that we can be a nation of laws and a nation of compassion, and these are not mutually exclusive ideas. They're in fact complementary, and they've been complementary up to this point until, quite frankly, we've seen the politics of Trump enter into state politics, and I believe this ad and this debate that we're having tonight is simply a downflow and an outflow of that kind of ridiculous, bottom-of-the-barrel, dog whistle, bullhorn politics that is divisive rhetoric that is dangerous for this state and also dangerous for this country.
I'll just say real fast, I'm not an immigrant. I'm a natural-born American citizen. My father, who was born in 1919 and lived through the Great Depression, who served in World War II, chasing Nazis through North Africa and into Italy, was working for the U.S. government in Canada. That's why we were in Canada at the time. I'm a natural-born American citizen.
I don't mean it as a pejorative, by the way.
To say I'm an immigrant is you playing politics and using pejoratives in the worst possible way. So to try to say that I've engaged in that kind of behavior is just so disingenuous, Mayor Gillum. I can't believe you would say that. In addition to that, what I will tell you is I'm not the great-grandson. I'm not the grandson. I'm the son of an immigrant. My father met my mother, who served also in World War II, who fought the Nazis in London, and she was an immigrant, a legal immigrant, because she married my father, and she got her citizenship. And all these policies where you allow illegal criminal immigrants to go out on the street and terrorize families and children and sons and daughters, all that does is undermine all those legal immigrants who've made our country fantastic, including my mom, who did it the right way, who waited in line and contributed to our society.
All right, we are right up against 8:44 right now. If you two are in agreement, we can do closing statements, go over a little bit. We had a second coin toss. Speaker Corcoran is a two-time winner here at the Florida Internet and TV studios. He's chosen to go last, and so, Mayor Gillum, you're recognized. Two-time
winner. I just want to thank Gary and Troy and obviously the speaker this evening, and I'll be brief. Richard Corcoran's view of the state of Florida is as a police state, where we turn teachers against students, where we turn neighbors against neighbors, where we turn law enforcement against the communities that they are charged to protect and to serve. That is, in my opinion, not the kind of state that we want, certainly not for my kids and not for anybody else's children. We have seen where public policy has used the guise of what is different as a way to create policy that protects us against or protects us for the rule of law. And all I'm saying is that we've seen this before and we've got to stand up against it. During the Jim Crow era of this country, we saw that people were maligned based off of the color of their skin, told where they could and could not go. During the Japanese internment, we saw people who were jailed based off of the way that they look in the name of public safety. During the era of McCarthyism, we saw everyday people being marched before congressional hearings and being told that they've got to somehow convince that jury or that panel of members of Congress of their patriotism. And during that time and in that period, we saw brave, everyday Americans standing up. Folks like Virgil Hawkins, folks like Dolores Huerta, folks whose names I cannot call and faces we may not know, who made a tremendous sacrifice and contribution to making this country a great place, and even in some places this state an even better place. And all I'm saying is that in this state, we can be a nation of laws and also a nation of compassion. We've been there before and we've done it before. And Richard Corcoran's version of Florida, I don't want my kids to grow up in it. And quite frankly, as a father to 3 brown kids, I don't want anybody's kids growing up in a state where you're demanded to be shown your papers and that you can be easily profiled based off of the way you look or the language you speak, or maybe even your country of origin. We're bigger than that. We're better than that. I believe that the Speaker owes the citizens of the state of Florida an apology. And I believe that he ought to take this ad down. Thank you again for your comment, your conversation this evening. I look forward to continued debate in the years, the months, and the weeks ahead.
Speaker.
Thank you both for hosting the forum. And Mayor Gillum, I'll say it again, the only people who benefit from you and I jumping into the arena and having this debate are the people of the state of Florida, and my hat's off to you for doing so. Having said that, I'll tell you, Mayor, you're wrong. Your entire close. Now we're going to talk about Jim Crow or Japanese internment. Those are situations where you had bad laws applied to innocent people. What this bill does is take good laws and apply it to criminals, bad people. They're just not even close. It doesn't empower teachers to do anything. It empowers law enforcement to cooperate with the federal authorities and hold criminal illegal immigrants for 48 hours. In fact, as I've said throughout this whole debate, and we've never had it, Mayor Gillum won't say whether he thinks it's okay. How is it right that American criminals are treated worse than illegal immigrant criminals? Won't answer. Where does he stand on 1333? Asked him 3 or 4 times. He won't say whether he wants to make the entire state a sanctuary state that would allow criminal illegal immigrants to go out on the street. And the ultimate thing for you to understand, if I could say to you before I finish, if you take one thing from this debate, if you remember one single thing from this debate, here's what I would ask you to remember. Nobody in this state should ever have a law enforcement officer knock on their door and tell them their son or their daughter has been killed by an illegal immigrant who had sanctuary status in a city, a completely and utterly needless and unnecessary death. Nobody should experience that. I will fight and continue to fight in this legislative session or in any capacity I can to ensure that no parent has to have that knock on the door. And if whatever it is that I have to do that, I will do it, because I believe, as I know the people of the state of Florida believe, that it's the right thing to do. It's a common sense, right-minded policy that protects the people of the state. Our primary job as elected officials. Thank you very much.
Well, with that, tonight's debate has now concluded. I'll tell you, they might disagree on the issue, but their teams have been so willing to engage with each other, we wouldn't be here tonight if not for that level of cooperation. We want to extend our thanks to Florida Internet and Television for allowing everybody to partake of their facility tonight. For Gary Fineout, I'm Troy Kinsey. Good evening.